A flash of light tore through the darkness, and a smile on a face shattered the silence of the city. Detective Agatha Marple, renowned for her cold, calculating mind, found herself ensnared in an investigation that was no mere murder, it was a fear-driven game. The smiling stranglers, whose aim was not just to kill, but to tell a terrifying tale through his chilling smile. As Agatha pushed further into the depths of this ruthless and cunning case, she realized that the answer could not come from a simple detective's logic. Her own deepest fears were entwined in this puzzle. But what would be the cost of facing those fears and uncovering the truth lurking beneath her own investigations? The night had settled heavily over London, a thick fog curling around every cobblestone and gaslight like a ghostly hand tracing the city's spine. The streets, slick with rain, shimmered under the dim glow of flickering lamps, their reflections stretching like phantom limbs across the pavement. The majestic theatre loomed ahead, its once grand facade now a weathered relic of past glories. Its marquee sputtered with failing bulbs, casting erratic shadows that danced like silent spectres on the wet ground. Somewhere in the depths of this decaying palace of illusion, a murderer had staged his latest performance. Detective Agatha Marple was here to unveil the truth. As she stepped out of the police motor car, her sensible heels clicked against the damp pavement, a measured contrast to the unease surrounding the scene. Two constables lingered near the slightly ajar stage door, their pale faces betraying their apprehension. The door itself gaped open like a sinister invitation, the darkness beyond it thick with an ominous silence. Agatha's sharp gaze swept over the entrance before she stepped forward, her breath steady, but her instincts alert. Inside, slumped against the splintered wooden backdrop, lay the victim. A middle-aged man, impeccably dressed in an expensive overcoat and silk tie, now forever frozen in an expression that sent a chill through even the most seasoned officers. His lips were pulled back into a grotesque smile, a mockery of joy, his wide, unseeing eyes locked in a silent scream. Around his throat, the telltale mark of strangulation, a deep red ligature bruise that spoke of a slow, deliberate death. Agatha crouched beside the corpse, her fingers brushing the fabric of his lapel. A smudge of white powder clung there, makeup, perhaps face powder, transferred from another person. Her brow furrowed slightly as she traced the residue, her mind already racing through possibilities. Before she could speak, one of the constables swallowed hard and pointed toward the victim's chest. "There's a note, detective," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Pinned to the dead man's coat was a small slip of parchment, its edges curling slightly from the damp air. Agatha unfastened it carefully and unfolded it, her eyes narrowing at the elegant yet unsettling script. "All the world's a stage, and I shall play my part with glee." Beneath the words, a signature scrawled with deliberate flair, "The Smiling Strangler." Agatha silently repeated the name, letting it roll through her thoughts like a key turning in a lock. There was something disturbingly theatrical about the entire scene, the exaggerated expression, the dramatic placement of the body, the taunting note. This was not just murder, this was a performance. A tremulous voice broke the silence behind her. "I only just found him, miss," the night watchman stammered, wringing his hands. "I heard something, a noise before I saw him." His breath hitched, the words catching in his throat. Laughter, like an actor practicing his lines. A cold thread of unease wound its way through Agatha's spine. She kept her tone measured, steady. "You did the right thing by calling us immediately," she assured him, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "Stay close. The inspector may have more questions for you." Straightening, she cast a sweeping glance over the crime scene. The faint glow of the marquee flickered against the fog, illuminating the eerie stillness of the alley. Face powder. A mocking note, a signature hinting at future performances. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the shrouded streets, the city breathed in its restless sleep. But Agatha could not shake the creeping sensation that this was only the opening act, and that somewhere, hidden within London's labyrinthine shadows, the smiling strangler was already preparing for his next role. A hush had settled over the rain-slicked streets of London, the air thick with the scent of damp stone and the acrid burn of gaslight. The majestic theatre loomed ahead, its once proud marquee flickering like a dying ember against the encroaching night. Detective Evelyn Harrow stepped from the police motor car, her sharp eyes scanning the cordoned-off alleyway, where a corpse slumped in grotesque stillness against the weathered brick. The victim, a man of obvious wealth, was dressed in a finely tailored coat, now marred by the grime of the street. His face was frozen in a ghoulish rictus, his lips stretched unnaturally wide in a parody of laughter, while a thin, livid mark around his throat whispered of a slow, deliberate death. But it was not the cause of his demise that sent a whisper of unease through Evelyn's spine, it was the small parchment pinned to his chest. With gloved fingers, she unfastened it, her breath steady even as her pulse quickened. A performance requires an audience, this is only the first act. The message, penned in an elegant yet unsettling hand, was signed simply, "The Grinning Phantom." Evelyn's brow knit as she turned the note over, seeking some hidden clue. Behind her the murmur of restless officers and the hum of the gathering press gnawed at the edges of the crime scene like scavengers circling a fresh carcass. Theatrical, brazen. A killer who wanted to be seen. A constable cleared his throat beside her. A witness, detective. The night watchman. She turned to find a rail-thin man wringing his hands, his breath coming in uneven bursts. I heard something, miss. A laugh just before I found him. Not a normal laugh, mind you. It was rehearsed, like an actor on stage. The words struck a chord deep within her. Theatre was illusion, deception wrapped in spectacle, and now, it seemed, it had become the stage for something far darker. A chill laced through the damp air as Evelyn straightened, her mind already threading possibilities together. The smudge of white powder on the victim's collar, the mocking note, the signature hinting at future horrors. Somewhere in the shadows, the grinning phantom was watching, waiting for the next act to begin. And Evelyn, with the weight of London's unsolved mysteries pressing against her shoulders, knew that this was only the prologue to something far more sinister. The dim glow of the street lamps cast long, trembling shadows across the cracked pavement as Detective Evelyn Harrow stood at the edge of the Scotland Yard parking lot. The day's tension had seeped into the night air, heavy with the smell of damp earth and industry, a ghostly reminder of the city's underbelly. A low hum of distant traffic merged with the sound of her boots tapping on the asphalt, each step measured, deliberate, yet haunted by the memory of the morning briefing. Inside the building, her mind remained sharp, focused on the case, but outside, the darkness seemed to swallow every sound, every breath. She was alone, save for the rhythmic pulse of the fog creeping in from the Thames. It was there in the quiet that she saw him, Detective Maximilian Roth, his towering figure silhouetted against the faint orange glow of the streetlights. He was deep in conversation with a young reporter, the eager look in the journalist's eyes betraying his hunger for more than just information. He wanted a story, a headline, a piece of drama. Roth's voice was smooth, confident, almost theatrical, as he spoke of the so-called smiling strangler, painting a picture of inevitability that grated against Evelyn's meticulous nature. She had been tracking the threads of this twisted case, carefully, methodically, while Roth, with his penchant for flair, seemed to be ready to rush to conclusions, to sensationalize the tragedy before the facts had even settled. Evelyn's gaze narrowed as she stepped forward, interrupting their conversation with a quiet but deliberate cough. Roth paused, his self-assured smile never faltering as the reporter, caught in his act, hastily closed his notebook. Evelyn's voice was cool, cutting through the tension. "I see you're making friends with the press, Roth. It's a bit premature, don't you think?" Roth's grin only deepened, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the chase. "Ah, Evelyn, always the pragmatist. But the public needs something to believe in. A killer like this, their fear is just as much a part of the performance as the act itself." Don't tell me you're above that." Evelyn's lips tightened, but her composure remained unwavering. "I'm not interested in the public's hysteria, Roth. I'm interested in the facts, and I suggest we stick to them, no matter how tempting it is to spin a tale." Roth laughed softly, a low, knowing sound. "A tale? My dear detective, I'm just pointing out the obvious. We're dealing with someone who thrives on the spotlight. Someone who knows how to manipulate, not just their victims, but the very narrative of the crime. I believe I'll be speaking to the lead actor at the Majestic Theatre tomorrow. Actors make the best storytellers, after all." Evelyn's hand tightened around the edge of her coat, a flicker of irritation flashing in her eyes, but she forced it down, steadying herself. "Actors or not, Roth, our next step is speaking to the stagehands, the designers. We need more than just theatrical hunches." Roth raised an eyebrow, his smile never leaving. "Of course, facts first, but we both know that sometimes the story finds you." With a dismissive wave, he turned back to the reporter, clearly more interested in the attention than the investigation itself. Evelyn, however, stood firm, watching him go, the weight of the case pressing down on her shoulders. The killer, the grinning phantom, as he now called himself, was playing a game that Evelyn intended to win, no matter how loud the drama around her grew. As she turned toward the building, the night air thickened, the distant rumble of thunder punctuating the unease in her chest. The performance was far from over, and this time, Evelyn would make sure she was the one in control of the narrative. A bitter wind swept through the empty street, carrying with it a sense of foreboding as Detective Olivia Fairchild stood at the threshold of the Majestic Theatre. The crumbling grandeur of the place spoke of past opulence now faded, like the remnants of a tragedy, slowly losing its grip on the public's imagination. Beneath the ornate chandeliers and faded frescoes, the heavy silence pressed in on her, amplifying the tension that had been building since her confrontation with Detective Julian Roth hours earlier. His dramatic flair, his insistence on playing to the public's thirst for sensationalism, clashed with her own methodical approach. She knew the killer's game, an orchestrated performance, a calculated spectacle. The truth wasn't something to be manipulated, it was something to be uncovered, piece by piece with precision. Yet Roth had insisted on feeding the media frenzy, claiming that instincts were the only real guide in cases like these. As if feeling a need to prove something more than professionalism, he had abandoned the facts, letting the shadows of his convictions dance too far ahead of the evidence. Now standing before the theater's decrepit entrance, Olivia knew the rivalry between them was more than just a clash of methods, it was a contest of egos. She had not forgotten his mocking smile, the air of superiority that radiated from him when he dismissed her as too cautious. But she would not allow herself to be swayed by his bravado. Inside, the theater was nearly as lifeless as the city outside. A lone custodian mopped the floors, his movements slow, mechanical, as if the space itself drained him of energy. The sense of loss lingered in the air, compounded by the remnants of a performance that had gone wrong, a twisted charade that had ended in death. Olivia's eyes narrowed as she passed the caretaker, her mind already racing of the few details she had managed to gather. The missing candelabra, a suspicious name in the supply logs. The theater manager, Mr. Lancaster, a man whose nervous fidgeting betrayed his own guilt. "Mr. Lancaster," Olivia began, her voice calm but unyielding, "let's talk about your recent productions. I understand there were some irregularities. Missing props, discrepancies in your inventory." The manager's hand tightened around a bundle of ledgers, as though they were his only lifeline. He motioned for her to follow him down a narrow corridor where a few stagehands lingered, their faces tight with apprehension. One, a stocky man with a scarred face, cleared his throat before speaking. "The candelabra disappeared just before closing night, Detective," he muttered, glancing around nervously. "We thought it was just a prank. Never imagined it could be connected to." His voice trailed off, and the tension in the room thickened. Olivia's gaze was sharp, her instincts clicking into place as she scrutinized the men around her. She turned back to Lancaster, who had set the ledgers down with a faint tremor in his hands. "That's not all, is it?" she pressed, her voice low, commanding. "You've had more than just missing props. The records show a series of odd deliveries, made under strange names. Tell me about Mr. Gray." Lancaster's face paled, and his fingers fidgeted with the pages, his breath shallow. "Mr. Gray," he hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the name. "It's a common pseudonym, detective, a way for people to keep their identities hidden. People who deal with unconventional suppliers. You know, for tax reasons or, well, other reasons." Olivia's eyes flicked to the name on the ledger, the one that had been hastily crossed out. She could almost hear the faint whisper of secrets being buried beneath the ink. She wasn't buying the story Lancaster was trying to sell. His nervousness, the way the men in the room shifted uncomfortably, all spoke volumes. There was more to this theater than just a botched performance. There were dark dealings, shadows lurking where the light should have been. As she moved deeper into the theater's bowels, Olivia could feel the weight of the case settling over her. She was on the trail of something bigger, something far more sinister than a simple missing prop. And Roth was chasing the spectacle, playing at the headlines, but she would uncover the truth. She would make sure the real killer, the one hiding behind all the masks, didn't escape unnoticed. As she walked through the backstage corridors, her mind already racing ahead to the next step, she knew that the game was just beginning. This was no longer about catching a killer, it was about peeling back the layers of deceit and uncovering the twisted theatrical mind behind the murders. And no one, least of all Julian Roth, was going to beat her to it. The air was thick with the stench of secrecy as Detective Clara Donovan stepped deeper into the cramped backstage of the theater, her eyes flicking across the dimly lit space with sharp precision. The silence, heavy with unspoken tension, seemed to whisper of hidden debts and veiled deals, the weight of the missing prop still hanging in the air. Could it have been taken to fund a secret transaction, a silent blackmailing that linked the theater's shadowy patrons to a web of illicit dealings? Every discarded script, every flickering stage light, felt like a silent testament to the grim reality playing out behind the curtains. Clara's mind spun, weaving through the possibilities, each thread tightening the mystery she was so determined to unravel. She knew better than to take anything at face value. Here, even the smallest detail might be the key to unlocking the puzzle. Her gaze, steady and unwavering, swept over the nervous faces of the stagehands as she addressed the room, her voice a cool contrast to the mounting tension. "I'll be speaking to each of you individually, and remember, no detail is too trivial. In cases like these, what seems insignificant could be the one thing that turns the tide." As she spoke, her eyes lingered on the ledger entry marked Mr. Gray, the name etched hastily, as if the mere mention of it could summon a storm of trouble. A soft footstep echoed from the dark hallway behind her, but Clara didn't flinch. There were secrets lurking in these walls, secrets that would soon be exposed. The theater itself seemed alive with the echoes of its hidden truths, each corner and forgotten prop whispering of the stories it held. As she snapped her notebook shut, a wry smile flickered across her face, though it never reached her eyes. "All the world's a stage," she muttered under her breath, "but in this case the actors wear masks." Stepping outside, the drizzle greeted her like an old acquaintance, cold and unforgiving. She was lost in thought, still pondering the cryptic Mr. Gray entry, when the soft patter of the rain was pierced by the distant sound of murmurs, growing louder with each passing second. Her heart skipped a beat as her instinct screamed that something had shifted, another revelation, darker and more sinister than before. Pressing through the gathering crowd, she felt the air around her grow thick with unease. The scene before her was haunting. Beneath the flickering streetlight, a stagehand lay motionless, his body twisted in a grotesque final act. The unmistakable mark of strangulation gripped his throat, and Clara felt her stomach tighten. His eyes stared into the void, unseeing, as raindrops clung to his frozen face, the wetness mingling with the horror of his demise. A gasp from the crowd confirmed what Clara had already feared. The victim was Horace, one of the backstage crew members from the Majestic. As if on cue, a note pinned to his coat fluttered in the wind, catching her eye. The stage is set for Act 2, The Smiling Strangler. A chill ran down her spine as she bent to examine the note, her fingers tracing the chilling message. Just as she stood, lost in thought, a voice cut through the crowd, brimming with theatrical flair. "Out of my way, please. Official business." It was Detective Ethan Blackwood, his presence almost a performance in itself, exuding an air of superiority as he pushed through the onlookers. His eyes met hers with a smirk. "I thought we'd be seeing another victim soon." Clara could feel her patience fray, but she ignored him, kneeling beside Horace's body. The remnants of stage makeup clung to his fingertips, a final touch from his work before tragedy struck. Blackwood, ever the showman, lingered behind her, offering unsolicited advice. "We need to handle this quickly, Donovan. The press will have a field day if we don't." Clara's jaw tightened, but she held her tongue, rising to her feet. The case had just taken a deadly turn, and Blackwood's theatrics were only adding to the mounting pressure. Uniformed officers swarmed the scene, their orders cutting through the air, while the sound of clattering radios and shouted commands filled the silence. It was clear that the death of another theater worker, linked so directly to the same sinister pattern, had escalated the stakes. Clara could feel the weight of the investigation bearing down on her, the stakes higher than ever. As she glanced at Blackwood, her resolve hardened. She would not let this twisted game overshadow her pursuit of the truth. The killer had made his mark, but she would make sure that his performance ended here. No encore. The scene shifted, and Clara found herself in the deputy commissioner's office, the plush, antique furnishings a stark contrast to the case's grim reality. The faint smell of polished wood and leather lingered in the air as she stood across from Deputy Commissioner Reed, a formidable man, whose presence radiated authority. The leather-bound folder in her hand held the key to the next stage of the investigation, and Reed's dismissive tone did little to deter her. "You're overcomplicating this, Donovan," he said, flipping through the pages of the report with a bored expression. "We need clear answers, not convoluted theories." Clara's eyes narrowed as she studied him. She had a feeling that Reed's disinterest in the theater's connection to the murders was more than just professional detachment. It was a carefully cultivated ignorance, one that might just keep him from seeing what was staring them all in the face. "I think you're missing something, Reed." Clara replied, her voice steady, "Something far more dangerous than you realize." The tension in the room was palpable as she laid out her suspicions. The killings were not just random acts of violence, but part of a larger, more intricate scheme. The strings of blackmail, the illicit deals hidden behind closed doors, and the enigmatic figure of Mr. Gray, all pointed to one chilling conclusion. The theater's shadows hid more than just the bodies of its victims. They were hiding the key to a far darker secret, and Clara would not rest until it was brought to light. Each word from Commissioner Hargrave was carefully measured, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "The strangler is likely a desperate felon, an unhinged drifter, out for chaos." His gaze snapped up, cold and unyielding. "We cannot entertain alarmist speculation about wealthy patrons or, God forbid, any influential officials. The press would tear us apart." Agatha felt the chill of his words seep into the room, despite the heat that pressed against her skin. She straightened, pushing back the unease that crawled up her spine. "Two victims are directly tied to the Majestic Theatre," she began, her voice steady yet filled with a quiet urgency. "The missing prop, the cryptic ledger entries all point to parties with deep pockets and hidden agendas. This isn't the work of a random criminal. Hargrave's polished smile never reached his eyes as he cut her off with a sharp, dismissive tone. The Yard has no interest in fabricating conspiracies. Focus on the facts. Street gangs, old grudges, practical suspects. Leave the rest. He slammed the folder shut with a finality that rang out in the heavy silence of the room. Behind him, the awards on the wall gleamed under the harsh light, their polished surfaces a stark contrast to the unspoken warning in Hargrave's words. "We can't afford to make waves," he said, his jaw tightening imperceptibly. "There are certain circles you cannot upset. Not now." Agatha's mind raced, the implications of his words sinking in like a stone in water. The power behind those circles was something far darker than mere bureaucratic politics. It was the kind of influence that could bury a killer's secret for good. Her pulse quickened beneath her calm exterior, but her composure never wavered. "Understood, sir," she said quietly, her voice controlled as she gathered her notes. She turned, taking one last look at the deputy commissioner, his steely figure framed by the cold luxury of his office. As she stepped into the hallway, her thoughts churned with a new, unsettling resolve. Someone within these walls was protecting powerful interests, someone who would go to any lengths to shield the truth. Her instinct screamed that the missing prop, the cryptic notes, and the unexplained gaps in the record were not mere coincidences. They were deliberate acts to cover the tracks of a killer, someone far more dangerous than an unhinged drifter. The thought gnawed at her as she left Hargrave's office, a silent vow forming in her mind. She would expose the truth, no matter the cost. It was then that she spotted it, the overlooked file, hidden in a corner of her desk. Her fingers brushed over the edges, pulling it free. Inside, the pages were chaotic, evidence scattered, missing reports, fragments of a case that no one wanted to piece together. Her stomach tightened as she realized what this meant. She wasn't just chasing a murderer, she was up against a network that wanted this all buried. The shadows in London's underbelly seemed to stretch further than she'd anticipated, their tendrils reaching into the most gilded corners of society. The game had changed, and now every piece on the board had a far more sinister meaning. She would need to tread carefully, no longer just following the obvious clues, but unmasking those who thought themselves untouchable. The forensics lab was a stark contrast to the suffocating tension of the office. The smell of antiseptic and formaldehyde clung to the air as Agatha descended into the basement, her footsteps echoing softly against the cold stone stairs. She felt an odd calm settle over her as she entered the lab, the narrow walls lined with specimen jars and battered textbooks. It was here, among the quiet hum of machines and sterile surfaces, that the truth had a habit of rising to the surface. But the moment she entered, she knew something was off. The usual air of efficiency was absent, replaced by a distinct unease. The lab technician, Alan, hovered by a desk, his face pale with a mix of confusion and apology. "Detective Marple," he greeted her shakily, twisting his lab coat nervously. "I'm afraid there's been an issue with the coroner's report from the first victim. It's disappeared, vanished." His voice faltered, and he gestured helplessly to the stack of disorganized folders. "I've searched twice, checked the archived shelves. It's nowhere to be found." Agatha's eyes narrowed as she took in the chaos of the desk. "Are you sure it was filed properly?" she asked, her tone measured, but with an edge of concern. Alan nodded quickly, his face flushing. "I personally initialed it when it came in," he said, his voice rising slightly in defense. "I can't understand how it just disappeared." Agatha's mind clicked into overdrive. Who would want to bury the coroner's findings, and why? Before she could press further, Alan led her to a cluttered examination table, where a small plastic case sat open, its contents almost too horrifying to examine. Inside was a fabric swatch, burnt at the edges, tinged with a suspicious brown hue. Alan's voice cracked as he spoke again. "This is the other problem, a chemical spill earlier, It compromised the fabric sample. It was from the victim's coat. We could have analyzed it for fibers, residue, anything. But now it's mostly useless. Agatha's frown deepened as she examined the scorched edges. The evidence was there, fragmented, imperfect, but still pointing towards something much darker than she'd anticipated. She could feel the walls closing in as the pieces of the puzzle seemed to slip further out of her grasp. Each thread she tugged at unraveling the fabric of the case even more. But she wouldn't stop. Not now. Not when the truth was so close, just out of reach, but still waiting to be found. The damage to the fabric was localized in such a precise manner that it seemed almost deliberate, an oddity that could have easily been missed, yet Agatha knew better. Accidents happen, certainly, she mused aloud, her voice cutting through the oppressive quiet of the lab, but something about the timing seemed too calculated. This timing, she added, her gaze sharp, is more than coincidental. A voice bracing and confident interrupted her thoughts. Quite so, came the reply, and from behind her stepped Detective Maximilian Roth, his perfectly tailored suit still pristine, a sharp contrast to the musty gloom of the basement. His usual bravado was replaced with a more subdued, almost contemplative air, a far cry from the cocky demeanor he usually exuded. I had the same reaction when Alan told me, Roth continued, his tone now serious. 2 anomalies in one day, the missing coroner's file and a chemical spill that ruins the best lead we had. This is sabotage, plain and simple. Agatha's eyebrow arched slightly. A moment ago, I might have suspected you of meddling, she said, a hint of challenge in her voice. You're no stranger to bold moves, Detective Roth. A flicker of cool amusement crossed his features. I'll admit, boldness is my forte in the field, he replied with a sly grin, but actively undermining evidence. Even I'm not that theatrical. Marble, Alan, caught in the middle of their exchange, glanced nervously between them, the tension in the room palpable. Agatha studied Roth carefully. His steady expression held no sign of deceit, but that only deepened her suspicion. If neither of us orchestrated this, she said, her voice softer now, then it points to someone inside the department, someone with enough power to cover their tracks. Roth moved closer, lowering his voice. Our smiling strangler might have an ally here at the yard, or at least a sympathizer in high places pulling the strings. He paused, his eyes locking with hers. Perhaps we'd be better off sharing information discreetly for the moment. Trust no one else. Agatha's surprise was evident, but she nodded, her mind racing with the possibilities his words opened up. The overhead light flickered once more, casting eerie shadows across the lab. Time was slipping away, and so were the vital pieces of their investigation. Outside, the fog of London wrapped the city in a cloak of secrecy, while beneath the yard's roof, shadows seemed to conspire against them. Agreed, she said, her voice low but resolute. We'll find out who's tampering with the evidence and why. The unspoken alliance between them, fragile as it was, had been forged in that moment, and together they returned to the charred fabric swatch. The answers they sought, however, remained hidden in the dark, elusive as ever. Hours later, London's fog-bound streets seemed to take on a life of their own, cloaking secrets in every mist-laden corner. The stillness of midnight was broken only by the faint drip of water from rusted gutters and the sputtering of gas lamps struggling to stay alight. A chill wind sliced through the narrow alleyway, whispering promises of things best left unsaid. Beneath the wavering glow of a dying street lamp, Detective Agatha Marple and Detective Maximilian Roth stood together, an uneasy truce between them. They had received an anonymous tip, a hushed warning that the smiling strangler would strike again, and so they found themselves waiting near the decaying Crown Playhouse. The theatre's faded facade loomed ominously before them, its shuttered windows offering no comfort. "We've been here nearly an hour," Agatha remarked, her voice cutting through the night's quiet. "If anyone's planning an encore, they're taking their time." Roth chuckled softly, the sound barely audible over the wind. "If your methodical approach were tempered by my inclination for bold moves," he said, "we might have flushed our suspect out by now." Agatha shot him a sidelong glance, her lips twitching into a barely perceptible smile. "Or we'd have scared him off entirely with some reckless flourish," she countered, her voice laced with mild reprimand. "I trust you recall last week's fiasco with the press." Roth's expression flickered with a brief flash of indignation. "We gleaned valuable leads from that, no matter what you imply," he said, his voice growing slightly colder. "And may I remind you that your systematic method hasn't yet yielded an arrest." His tall figure cast a long shadow under the failing lamp, his usual confidence now tinged with something sharper, less playful. They fell into silence, the distant hum of the city and the faint clamor of nighttime traffic, the only sounds accompanying them. As the minutes stretched into an uncomfortable stillness, they found themselves huddled in a derelict doorway, seeking shelter from the biting wind. Roth broke the silence first, his voice subdued. "You know, I never intended to be a detective," he said, glancing sideways at Agatha. "I grew up in Whitechapel. My father was a dock worker, lost everything in a strike. I learned early on that the powerful can crush the powerless." His voice softened, the theatricality of his usual bravado stripped away. "Beating them at their own game, taking the fight to criminals whoever they might be, felt just." Agatha studied him, faintly surprised by his candor. The words lingered in the air between them, an unspoken understanding growing. She felt a twinge of empathy, a rare connection she hadn't expected to find in him. "My mother believed in discipline, in structure," she said softly, her tone betraying a hint of vulnerability. "She always said that if you follow the correct method, the truth will reveal itself." Roth gave a slight nod, his eyes narrowing in thought. There in the quiet darkness of the alley, something unspoken shifted between them, a tentative, fragile bond forged not just in shared purpose, but in the raw truths they had yet to fully confront. A rare smile tugged at the corner of Agatha's lips, the briefest flicker of amusement in the midst of their exasperating pursuit. Roth couldn't help but let out a soft, bemused laugh. "Exasperating or not, you've got a knack for it," he remarked, and their eyes met in a brief but telling moment. There was no mockery, no rivalry, just a flicker of something akin to mutual respect that passed between them. But before either could linger on it, the alley was disturbed by a scuffle of movement. Both detectives whipped around, their instincts kicking in as they saw a shadow dart past the failing gaslight. A hooded figure, swift and deliberate, bolted into the night. Without a word, Agatha and Roth sprang into action, their boots splashing through slick puddles as they chased after the elusive figure. The sharp echoes of their footsteps ricocheted off narrow brick walls, their hearts pounding in sync with the adrenaline coursing through their veins. Agatha's fatigue evaporated in the heat of pursuit, replaced by a razor-sharp focus. Yet the figure was fast, weaving effortlessly through the winding labyrinth of streets. When they finally reached the dead end, a forgotten yard cluttered with abandoned crates, the figure had vanished. The only trace was the faintest whisper of water dripping somewhere in the darkness. Roth cursed softly, his frustration mounting, but Agatha's sharp gaze caught something on the ground, something that didn't belong, a crumpled stage mask, its painted smile staring up at them like a cruel mockery. She crouched down, heart thudding, and picked it up with trembling fingers. "They led us on a chase," she murmured, her voice tight with realization, "but they left this behind, as if to taunt us." Roth exhaled sharply, his tone turning cold, "or to misdirect us. Either way, we're left with nothing more than a prop." They had no victory to claim tonight, no villain captured, but in that fleeting moment, the chase had revealed something deeper, an unspoken shift between them. As they stood there, the tension of the chase settled into the thick silence of the night. They returned to their station in the same wordless manner, the fog of London pressing against them like a heavy unseen weight. Under the dim light of a single street lamp, their shared mission seemed all that mattered, the rivalry forgotten in the face of the killer they both pursued. The quiet was broken by the sudden sharp rap of a telegram envelope being slid through the cafe door. Agatha's hand froze on her coffee mug as she looked up to find the harried waitress holding it, her gaze flicking nervously between the two detectives. "Which one of you is Detective Agatha Marple?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Agatha exchanged a brief, wary glance with Roth before standing to accept the envelope. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her as she ripped it open, her eyes scanning the contents. The words sent a chill through her veins. "Curtain call awaits. The final act draws nigh. Seek the royal stage or watch the innocents die." The smiling strangler. Roth leaned forward, his expression unreadable as he processed the rhyme. A bit more theatrical this time, he noted dryly, his voice laced with skepticism. Agatha's fingers tightened around the paper, the words swirling in her mind. "The royal stage," she repeated softly, a quiet horror creeping into her voice. "The Royal Playhouse. They're debuting a revival of The Mask of Mortality next week, an old Victorian production. It's scheduled to open Friday." Roth's brow furrowed, the lines of calculation sharp on his face. He's referencing the play's final act, no doubt. The killer's either drawn to the play's darker themes or he's taunting us with a clue, giving us a hint about when he'll strike next. Agatha took a deep sip of her coffee, the heat of it grounding her as she processed the chilling implications. The smiling strangler had already claimed 2 victims, both with ties to the theatre. If this riddle pointed to the Royal Playhouse, a venue frequented by London's most influential patrons, then a 3rd victim could be in grave danger. She glanced at Roth, the usual challenge in his gaze, replaced by a sharp, earnest glimmer. "We need to warn the production staff," Agatha said, her voice steady but urgent. "Perhaps quietly examine the cast list. We can't afford to alert everyone and spark a panic, but we need to be discreet." Roth nodded, the brash bravado that had once marked him slipping away in the face of the killer's escalating boldness. "We can't risk spooking anyone," he agreed, his tone now more measured. "But we'll have to collaborate more closely than ever before." The weight of that truth hung between them, and for a fleeting moment, their rivalry seemed meaningless in the face of the deadly force they were up against. Outside, the neon reflections of the cafe lights danced in the puddles, the rain still falling relentlessly. Agatha set the telegram down with quiet resolve. "Agreed," she said, her voice firm. "We'll need to watch each other's backs on this." The streets of London continued to hum with life, oblivious to the silent alliance forming between 2 detectives, bound by the need to unmask a killer who was orchestrating a deadly play on the city's stage. The sound of soft jazz filled the grand ballroom, a gentle undercurrent to the polished extravagance of the Rosemont Gala, where London's elite mingled, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. The glittering chandeliers reflected light onto the marble floor, but the warmth of the scene was only a veil, concealing the darker truths that lurked beneath. Among the gilded guests, detectives Agatha Marple and Maximilian Roth blended effortlessly, their appearances impeccable, their presence unnoticed. Dressed in elegant evening attire, Agatha in a gown that whispered sophistication, Roth in a tailored suit that hinted at a man of wealth, they were far from the affluent couple they appeared to be. Instead, they were here undercover, guests of convenience at a charity event raising funds for the arts, specifically theatre productions. This, they suspected, was where vital clues to the smiling strangler case would be found. Agatha, champagne glass delicately gripped in her gloved hand, glanced at Roth. "We make a good pair," she murmured, her voice barely rising above the hum of conversation. Roth's gaze scanned the crowd with practiced ease. "It seems our ability to improvise is proving useful," he responded, a touch of camaraderie threading through his words. Their shared resolve had transformed their rivalry into an unexpected partnership. As the evening unfolded, Agatha's sharp eyes swept the crowd for anyone linked to the theatre world, someone who might offer a crucial piece of the puzzle. Her gaze landed on a well-dressed man in the corner, laughing boisterously with his entourage. Baron d'Aubin, his shock of silver hair striking against the opulence of his evening wear, was known in certain circles for dealing in illegal transactions. His presence here, surrounded by the city's elite, was far from reassuring. Agatha's heart skipped a beat as her eyes moved to the man beside him, Commissioner Fitzgerald. He had always been a shadow in her mind, a figure whose involvement in the investigation had been clouded with suspicion. Now here he was, laughing too loudly, too familiarly with the Baron. Agatha signaled wrath, and they glided through the crowd, drawing closer to the two men, their eyes scanning for any slip, any hint of their true intentions. The conversation between Fitzgerald and d'Aubin was low, their words clipped and urgent beneath the surface of polite pleasantries. Agatha strained to catch every word. The documents, hush money, everything's in order. Fitzgerald's voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it, a quiet urgency. The deposits made. No further inquiries, d'Aubin's cultured accent replied, his tone equally measured, but with a note of finality. Agatha's pulse quickened, evidence stashed away. The words echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder of the tampered coroner's file, and the missing piece of fabric that had never sat right. She reached into her evening bag, her fingers trembling slightly as she pulled out a small notepad, jotting down every word she could capture. Roth, ever the stoic, stood beside her, his expression unreadable, but Agatha could feel the tension radiating off him. The pieces were falling into place, and what they had just overheard confirmed their darkest suspicions. Fitzgerald, a figure within Scotland Yard, who should have been their ally, was entwined in something far more sinister. He was in league with a notorious figure from the black market, discussing bribes, hidden evidence, and a sinister connection to the Smiling Strangler. As the jazz band played on, the crowd oblivious to the quiet storm unfolding just beyond their view, Agatha and Roth slipped away into the shadows. Their hearts pounded with the weight of what they had discovered. Agatha tucked her notepad away, the truth now hanging over them like a dark cloud. The Strangler's web was far more tangled than they had ever anticipated, and they were no closer to unraveling it than before, but now they knew they were up against more than just a killer. They were facing an entire system built on deceit and corruption. The stifling tension in the dimly lit hallway felt like a living thing, pressing in on Agatha and Roth as they stood before Assistant Commissioner Fitzgerald. The gala's glittering facade of laughter and clinking glasses seemed a world away from the grim confrontation unfolding in the shadowed corridor. Agatha's voice cut through the silence, cold and controlled, her words laced with a simmering fury she could no longer hide. "We know about your dealings with Baron d'Aubin, the hidden evidence, the forged documents, all in service of protecting whoever is orchestrating these killings," she said, her tone sharp and unwavering. Fitzgerald's expression tightened, his steely eyes narrowing with a flash of anger. "You're treading on dangerous ground," he warned, his calm demeanor belying the menace lurking beneath. "Digging any deeper will ruin your careers, and worse your reputations." Roth's jaw clenched, his fists flexing as if he were barely holding back the urge to act. "You may have a badge, Fitzgerald, but blackmail is a crime, even for you," he countered, his voice low, filled with menace. Fitzgerald's lips curled into a sneer. "You think you're on the side of justice," he mocked, stepping closer, the weight of his words pressing down on them. "The Smiling Strangler has powerful patrons, people who will stop at nothing to protect their secrets, their wealth, their comfort. My actions were about preserving order. Without it we'd have public panic, scandal and financial ruin. You have no idea what's at stake." Agatha's heart clenched in disbelief, her voice quiet but fierce. "Call it order if you like, but your complicity has cost innocent lives. How many more, Fitzgerald, just to maintain your precious status quo?" The silence between them stretched taut, broken only by the distant hum of conversation from the ballroom. Fitzgerald's gaze hardened, and in the faint flicker of the hallway's lights, the weight of his choices became visible, yet there was no remorse in his eyes, only resolve. "Ambition drives you both," he spat, his voice like a soft, dangerous purr. You should consider using that ambition for something safer, because if you continue to meddle, you'll not only lose your badges but something far more precious." Agatha stood tall, her spine rigid as steel, her eyes never leaving his. Roth's muscles tensed beside her, his silent fury evident, but he held his composure. Together they stood resolute, facing a man whose corruption stretched deep within the system. Agatha's voice was unwavering as she replied, "We won't stand aside while a killer roams free, nor will we let you protect him." Roth's tone mirrored hers, cold, determined. "Save your threats, Fitzgerald. We'll do our duty, even if you refuse to do yours." A long charged moment passed, the air thick with unspoken defiance. Then, with the faintest of sneers, Fitzgerald turned on his heel, his footsteps echoing as he stalked away, his shoulders rigid with suppressed fury. Left in his wake, Agatha and Roth exchanged a glance, the unspoken understanding between them clear. The night's performance was far from over. The final waltz might be playing in the ballroom, but the real dance of power, manipulation, and dangerous games was just beginning. "That went as well as expected," Roth muttered, exhaling the breath he had been holding. Agatha smoothed her gown, her expression composed though beneath the surface. Her mind raced. "Then we press on," she replied, her voice resolute. The path ahead was more dangerous than ever, but they would walk it, no matter the cost. The truth had become their only weapon, and they would wield it with unrelenting determination, no matter how many threats came their way. The night felt thick with impending doom, as Agatha and Roth stood before the dilapidated shell of the Rosewood Theatre, its grandeur long eroded by time and decay. The once stately facade now bore only the faintest traces of its former elegance, a haunted remnant of a bygone era, the fire scars on its walls, a grim reminder of its tragic past. As they stepped into the theatre's hollowed heart, the stale air pressed in on them, mingling with the faint smell of mold and rot. Broken seats lined the aisles, their upholstery torn and sagging, as if reflecting the theatre's forgotten glory. The curtains, heavy with decades of dust, hung limp and lifeless from their rusted rods, and the stage itself was marred by deep gouges in the wood, the remnants of past performances fading into oblivion. Yet, in this forsaken place, they would witness the final act of a twisted drama. Agatha's eyes swept over the desolate auditorium, her mind sharp as she calculated the positioning of her team. The stage might be a crumbling ruin, but it would bear witness to the end of the Smiling Strangler's macabre performance, if their plan succeeded. At her side, Roth adjusted his collar, his stance resolute, a silent vow in his gaze. They had assembled a small discreet team of officers, men and women, who had proven their loyalty and resistance to the corruption that plagued the higher ranks. Keeping the operation a secret from Fitzgerald and his allies had required careful maneuvering, with clandestine orders passed only in whispers, at odd hours, and through covert channels to ensure no trace of the operation remained on record. As Agatha ran a gloved hand over the rotting edge of the stage, she glanced back at Roth. "We'll need decoys posted on either side of the wings," she murmured, her voice steady despite the unease gnawing at the edges of her resolve. "2 more by the box seats. Keep them out of sight, no flashlights, no sudden movements." Roth nodded sharply, his face betraying nothing but the calm intensity that mirrored her own. "Peters and Marshall are in the left balcony, Baker and Wong backstage. They've got the best shots if things go sideways." A soft flutter of wings echoed from above as a lone pigeon startled from its perch, its flight a fleeting disturbance in the otherwise oppressive silence. Though the theatre stood empty of any audience, Agatha couldn't shake the eerie feeling that the Smiling Strangler's final note had been played, the grand finale promised at midnight, and it was leading them straight into the heart of this forsaken playhouse. Whether it was a cruel hoax or a genuine invitation remained to be seen. As footsteps approached, the distant sound of a uniformed constable broke the silence, his breath clouding in the damp air as he reported that all positions were set. Agatha gestured for Roth to follow her as they made their way to their vantage point, a cramped nook behind the side curtains, the ruined drapery offering only a partial view of the stage. It was here they would wait, hidden in the shadows, hoping to catch the killer in the act, or at the very least, corner him before he could vanish once more into the labyrinth of London's dark streets. Time stretched on in agonizing silence. The clock in the foyer, rusted and unreliable, chimed mournfully, its hollow echo a cruel mockery of time's passing. The only true measure of time was the quickening beat of their hearts, each pulse filled with a sense of urgency, a weight that pressed down with every minute. The air was thick with dread, every creak of a floorboard, every drop of water plunking into a forgotten puddle, amplifying the tension that coiled through the room. Agatha's breath stirred the dust that hung suspended in the dim glow of her concealed lantern, the particles swirling around her as if responding to the tension in her chest. Her mind churned with possibilities. Would the killer appear in disguise, blending into the shadows of the stage, or would he come as he had before, a nameless figure hidden behind the mask of a stagehand? The thought that Fitzgerald might have discovered their plan lingered at the edge of her thoughts like a shadow, but she forced it aside. They had uncovered too many secrets, unearthed too many dangerous truths, to turn back now. No matter the cost, they would see this through to the end. Roth's watchful gaze never wavered as he stood by her side, his presence a silent promise that they would face whatever came together. Their rivalry had led them to this moment, a moment that might very well be the culmination of their investigation, the final confrontation with a murderer who reveled in the theatrics of his twisted game. Despite the tension that gnawed at the corners of her mind, a flicker of anticipation burned within her. Tonight, they would uncover the truth. Tonight, the curtain would fall on the smiling strangler's reign of terror, and they would be waiting when it did. Midnight arrived with a heavy, almost supernatural stillness hanging over the Rosewood Theatre. The soft shuffle of uneasy feet behind the decaying scenery was the only sound that dared to break the silence. From her hidden position, Agatha's eyes never left the stage, her every nerve honed and alert, ready for whatever twisted performance the night would bring. The theatre was shrouded in silence, as if the entire building were holding its breath. Suddenly, a piercing beam of light shot from the rafters, the solitary spotlight bursting into existence above the decaying stage. The harsh brilliance sliced through the darkness like a blade, casting long unsettling shadows across the crumbling floorboards. Within that harsh rectangle of light, a figure slowly emerged, its presence as chilling and inevitable as the final notes of a death march. The smiling strangler, London's nightmarish spectre, stood at the center of the stage, a grotesque vision of twisted theatricality. His mask, a patchwork of cracked weathered leather, contorted his face into a mockery of joy, a painted grin that sent shivers down the spine of anyone who dared to meet it. The rest of his face was shrouded in shadow, leaving only the disturbing silhouette of his mask to dominate the light. He stood there like a cruel statue, gloved hands raised in an eerie predatory pose, as if savoring the unfolding drama. The old theatre, long abandoned and decaying, seemed to hold its breath. Even the ghosts of its former patrons appeared to have been silenced, unwilling to stir in the presence of this malevolent figure. Agatha's heart hammered in her chest, but her mind was a blade, sharp and unwavering. At her side, Roth stood as still as a shadow, every muscle coiled and alert. Hours of waiting, of stealthy preparation, had led them here to this moment. The final act was about to begin. The strangler's voice shattered the silence like glass breaking, rich and smooth, laced with both mockery and admiration. "Ah, Detective Marple, Inspector Roth," he sang, addressing them directly. His words were dripping with a sickly sweetness, as though he relished the game they were playing. "You've been quite clever, haven't you, chasing after my little performances? But in the end, you serve only a system of fools, men in uniforms, parading medals and lies. I merely pulled back the curtain on their hypocrisy. I've exposed the rotten core of your world, and in doing so I've become its true face." Agatha stepped from the shadows, her movement deliberate, her presence a striking contrast to the Strangler's grotesque theatrics. Her voice, though calm, cut through the air like a cold wind. "And how many innocent lives have you sacrificed for this twisted show?" she asked, her words measured but imbued with a quiet fury that radiated from her every word. The spotlight flickered slightly, casting a ghostly light on her determined face, the faint glimmer of resolve in her eyes unmistakable. The Strangler let out a low, mocking laugh, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the theater. "In a city like this, who is truly innocent?" he responded, his voice oozing disdain. "Everyone has their secrets, their darkness. Each victim is merely a piece in the grand finale I've orchestrated, my legacy, a testament to the truth that no one can be trusted." His gloved hand extended, the gesture twisted in its elegance, as though he was bowing to them, to the audience of none. "You've almost made this entertaining," he said, his eyes gleaming with a maddening delight. The air around them thickened with tension, but Agatha's resolve remained unshaken. She met his gaze with a steel-like determination, her voice unwavering as she declared, "This ends tonight." Her words hung in the air, the finality of them reverberating through the abandoned theater like the toll of a death knell. Roth moved beside her, his posture alert, ready for whatever came next. The Strangler, a predator to the last, didn't hesitate. His hand darted beneath his coat, and before Agatha could react, he was already climbing the catwalk ladder in a fluid motion, as though he had performed this dance countless times before. His movements were swift, confident, a perfect embodiment of his belief that no one could catch him. But Agatha and Roth were ready. They sprang into action, their feet pounding against the rotted floorboards, the sound of their chase cutting through the eerie stillness like thunder. They pursued him through the maze of darkened aisles and torn curtains, their breaths ragged, the chase an adrenaline-fueled blur. The catwalk above creaked and swayed under their pursuit, the ancient rigging groaning under their weight. Dust billowed in the air, swirling in the beams of the lone spotlight that still shone down, casting fleeting glimpses of their movements. The Strangler was nimble, a wraith in the shadows, but Agatha was closing in. Her feet were sure, her focus absolute as she gained on him with each stride. Roth was close behind, anticipating the Strangler's next move. His eyes flicked to the upper balcony, and with a grunt, he made his move, cutting off the Strangler's escape. With a final desperate effort, the killer turned, trying to pivot to evade Roth, but the detective was faster. In one fluid motion, Roth launched himself forward, tackling the Strangler to the catwalk. The collision was thunderous, a violent tremor shaking the structure beneath them. The Strangler's body was thrown off balance, his momentum halted just inches from the edge. With a growl of fury, he lashed out, but Roth was already on him, twisting his wrist until the garrote wire fell from his gloved hand. Roth pinned the Strangler's arms behind his back with professional efficiency, his breath coming in sharp bursts. Below them, uniformed officers rushed onto the stage, their presence marking the end of the chase. But even as the Strangler's laughter echoed in the vast, decaying space of the theater, it was not the triumphant sound of a villain defeated, it was the hollow, maniacal laugh of someone who knew the game was far from over. "You think you've won," he sneered, his voice laced with venom. "This is just the beginning. You'll never root out the rot at the heart of your institutions. No matter how many of us you catch, the disease will remain." Agatha's handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the cold metal biting into his skin, but the killer's words lingered in the air, a chilling reminder of the rot that festered beneath the surface. As the officers moved in, securing the Strangler, the theater seemed to exhale, the ghostly weight of its tortured past lifting, at least for now. Agatha and Roth exchanged a glance, their faces grim. The killer had been caught, but his final words echoed in their minds, a grim warning. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The corruption he had so gleefully exposed still lay hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the next twisted soul to seize the spotlight. As the first light of dawn broke through the shattered windows of Scotland Yard, a sea of reporters rushed in, cameras flashing, eager for their story. But Agatha and Roth knew the truth. They had only scratched the surface. The Strangler's capture was just one chapter, and the darkness within London's heart was far deeper than anyone realized. The light from the dimmed chandelier above flickered sporadically as the final reporters hustled into the briefing room, their footsteps swift and purposeful as they jockeyed for space, cameras flashing incessantly. The room buzzed with a palpable anticipation, the air thick with whispered speculations and the rustle of notepads, as though every individual was on edge, waiting for the moment the full truth would spill into the open. The double doors at the front swung closed, ushering the last of the latecomers to their places against the walls, where they stood in stony silence. At the head of the room, a heavy wooden podium stood gleaming under the harsh white lights, its surface etched with the Metropolitan Police's insignia. It was polished to perfection, but to those who knew the true state of affairs, it bore the scars of an institution long past its prime, now with its cracks laid bare for all to see. A murmur of disbelief passed through the crowd as the magnitude of the moment set in. Assistant Commissioner Fitzgerald, once the embodiment of law and order, now stood on the precipice of public disgrace. Agatha Marple stood slightly to one side, poised and seemingly unruffled despite the storm of flashing cameras and whispered questions. The subtle tension around her eyes betrayed the weight of the moment, one she had spent years working towards. She knew this was more than just a victory for the case. It was the dismantling of an empire of corruption that had shielded its own for far too long. And yet, despite the monumental nature of her success, there was no satisfaction, only an unrelenting sense of duty and resolve. She had come this far, but the war was far from over. The press room fell into a tense silence as Commissioner Hayes stepped forward to the podium, the gravitas of his next words heavier than ever. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press," his voice rang out, every syllable carrying the weight of an institution teetering on the edge of collapse. "It is with the gravest concern that we announce the suspension of Assistant Commissioner George Fitzgerald, pending a full investigation into charges of evidence tampering, bribery, and conspiracy to obstruct justice." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, the reporters' pens furiously scratching at their notepads, already drafting the headlines that would rock the city tomorrow. Some had suspected corruption at the highest levels. No one, however, had anticipated this bombshell. The cameras snapped incessantly, capturing every inch of the room's transformation from a space of subdued formality to one of public spectacle. Fitzgerald's confession had been a long time coming, but the brashness with which it was now laid out left no room for denial. A shocked ripple ran through the room as murmurs broke out among the press. Some had known, some had suspected, but all now knew the full depth of the rot that had festered beneath Scotland Yard's polished surface. Agatha's expression remained steady, but within her the reality of what had just been laid bare hit with a crushing force. She had brought this darkness into the light, but at what cost? Lives had been ruined, reputations shattered, the very foundations of trust had been torn apart. Yet still, she stood, firm, unwavering, her resolve stronger than ever. As Hayes continued, his words were measured, and for a brief moment, Agatha caught her breath. Additional officers under Fitzgerald's command are being questioned regarding their involvement in these activities. The reporters' questions were relentless, but one voice rose above the rest. A reporter adjusted his spectacles, clearing his throat before shooting a pointed question across the room. What role did Detective Marple play in uncovering Fitzgerald's involvement? The room shifted. Agatha could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on her now. The stage had been set. It was her time to speak. Hayes, however, was quick to offer his answer. Detective Marple's investigative methods have been nothing short of exemplary. It was her tireless work that uncovered the trail linking the so-called Smiling Strangler murders to the corruption within our own ranks. Her persistence in the face of overwhelming pressure brought us to the truth, a truth that, had it not been for her, may have remained buried forever. A surge of cameras clicked to life, capturing Agatha's stoic composure, her professional veneer masking the emotional turmoil brewing beneath. It was the moment she'd prepared for, yet it was still too much to process fully. She had known Fitzgerald was at the heart of it all, but his smug certainty, that twisted confidence he exuded even in the face of his downfall, still gnawed at her. The room seemed to shrink as a wave of new questions flooded the air, each one probing deeper into the mysteries yet to be uncovered. But Agatha, ever the composed professional, gave nothing away. Then she stepped forward. The weight of her actions, of the years she had spent following the trail through dark alleys, shadowy figures, and the crumbling corners of the city's forgotten streets, settled on her shoulders. But there was no time for self-reflection, not yet. She cleared her throat and addressed the room, her voice steady but with an edge of unshakable certainty. We owe a debt to the honest men and women of the yard who assisted in securing this evidence. But the real lesson here is that corruption can take root in even the most revered institutions. We must remain vigilant. If we turn a blind eye, we will allow it to fester once again. For the sake of those we are sworn to protect, we must ensure that the truth is always heard. Her words lingered in the air, a silent command that resonated deep within the hearts of those who listened. The cameras flashed wildly, capturing her in that singular moment of conviction. Yet, even as the press began to disperse and the room started to empty, a nagging thought clung to Agatha's mind. The strangler's warning echoed in her ears. Was this truly the end, or was it merely the calm before a far more dangerous storm? Despite the victory, the puzzle was far from complete, and in the murky depths of the yard's shadowed corridors, something or someone still lurked, waiting for its turn to step into the light. As Agatha caught sight of Maximilian Roth across the room, leaning against the back wall with a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips, a fleeting moment of peace washed over her. The rivalry that had once defined their relationship had melted away in the fire of shared purpose. For now they had won, but they both knew the war was far from over. The rain continued to hammer against the window of Detective Agatha Marple's office, its rhythmic beat adding an almost mournful soundtrack to the chaos that surrounded her. The walls were littered with photographs, faded newspaper clippings, and a sprawling network of red yarn that connected a tangle of clues, all leading to the same conclusion: the unmasking of the smiling strangler. Yet, despite the relief that should have come with solving such a grisly case, an unsettling silence hung in the air, a silence that seemed to echo the unspoken truth that London's shadows would never fully be banished. Agatha stood, her gaze fixed on the evidence board as if trying to discern something more, something hidden between the lines. The case was closed, but her mind was still restless. She could feel it in the air, the unease, the gnawing sense that the darkness of the city was far from eradicated. There were always more secrets to uncover, more dangers lurking in the corners of this crumbling metropolis. The strangler had been captured, but his parting words echoed in her mind with disturbing clarity: every encore needs an audience. The limelight never truly darkens. Wait for my next curtain call. You'll know my mark when you see it. It was a taunt, a challenge, a reminder that even in defeat, he remained a dangerous force. The door to her office creaked open, interrupting her reverie, and Detective Maximilian Roth entered, his usual swagger replaced by a quiet seriousness. There was no hint of the cocky charm he had once worn like armor. Instead, his eyes held something more genuine: respect, perhaps, or understanding. "Word on the street is I'm quite the hero these days," he said, his voice carrying an ironic edge, though his lips twitched with a half-smile. Agatha couldn't help but offer a small subdued smile of her own. "The papers do love a dramatic figure," she replied, her tone cool and measured. "If they appreciate spectacle, you're certainly their man." The words were teasing, but there was no malice behind them, just a quiet acknowledgement of the roles they had played in bringing the strangler to justice. For a moment neither spoke, the weight of their shared history settling between them. Their previous rivalry, once sharp and bitter, had softened over the course of their investigation, replaced by something far more complicated: camaraderie, perhaps even mutual respect. It had been Agatha's meticulousness that had cracked the case, her unrelenting pursuit of the truth that had finally brought the killer to light. Roth, with his showmanship and flair, had added the drama when necessary, but it had been Agatha's precision that had been the key. Roth broke the silence by pulling a small envelope from his coat pocket. He handed it to Agatha, his expression darkening slightly. "Found this on the strangler when we processed the evidence. Didn't want it falling into the wrong hands." Agatha's fingers tingled as she took the envelope, the weight of it somehow heavier than she expected. She opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the neat looping handwriting inside. The words were simple but chilling. "Every encore needs an audience. The limelight never truly darkens. Wait for my next curtain call. You'll know my mark when you see it." A shiver ran down her spine despite the warmth of the room. The strangler was behind bars, yet his mind was far from broken. His words hinted at something deeper, an unyielding will to remain a player in this game, even in defeat. Agatha set the note down on her desk, the message a dark reminder that no matter how many villains she brought to justice, there would always be another one waiting in the wings. Roth leaned against the evidence board, his gaze fixed on Agatha as he studied her reaction. "A showman to the bitter end," he murmured, a slight edge of admiration in his voice. "Let's hope we don't get that encore." Agatha's eyes narrowed as she stared at the note, her mind already racing. "We'll be ready," she said firmly, her voice carrying the conviction that had become a hallmark of her career. Roth nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "I'll hold you to that, detective," he said, with a soft smile before turning to leave. Agatha stood still for a moment, the weight of the case pressing on her chest, and then as the door closed behind him, she crossed to the window. The sky outside had darkened further, the evening's gloom pressing against the city like a suffocating blanket. The streets below glistened with rain, reflecting the flickering streetlights and the unspoken stories of the city. Agatha's gaze lingered on the skyline, her thoughts drifting to the future. The strangler may have been caught, but the note he had left behind was a warning. The darkness that lurked in London's underbelly was never truly gone, it only waited, like a shadow at the edge of a stage, ready for its next performance. Agatha's resolve hardened as she turned away from the window, the weight of her responsibility settling around her shoulders. For every sinister performance, she whispered to herself, there will be another act of justice. She was ready, calm, vigilant, and prepared to bring down the final curtain on anyone who dared threaten the fragile peace of her city. The game was far from over, and Agatha Marple would be at the center of it, leading the charge against whatever darkness awaited.